Our final presenter is Keygan Perkins, who I had the great pleasure of working with as her advisor on this project. I'm going to turn things over to you, especially the fascinating project that I'll allow her to introduce on the Brothers Grimm and their Kinder und Hausmärchen.
I focused on the Brothers Grimm's Kinder und Hausmärchen. The title of my presentation is Flat Slippers, Red Hoods, and the Rise of German Nationalism, German Identity of the Early 1800s, as seen in the Brothers Grimm's Kinder und Hausmärchen. Okay, we'll start out with some historical context behind the making of the book, and just to give you a little bit of an idea about the environment that the Brothers Grimm grew up in. So, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, better known to us as the Brothers Grimm, we were born in 1785 and 1786, and in their childhood, the Napoleonic Wars started. Many Germanic states were occupied. At the time, there was no unified Germany. It was a bunch of smaller little kingdoms and duchies, and then the two big states were Prussia and Austria at the time. So the Napoleonic Wars brought to Germany the Napoleonic Code, which brought a more liberal civil rights code to Germany, and also the occupation. There was a lot of violence, a lot of battles in the war. And then the Four-Months period was after that. It involved a lot of discussion of what a unified Germany would look like, and it included censorship of published works, including folk/fairy tales, as there was the rejection of pretty much anything French. This period ended with the failed revolutions against the monarchies of the time, and Germany stayed not unified until 1871, where it was unified under Kaiser Wilhelm I of Prussia. So getting into nationalism, romanticism, and Germanness. So Merriam-Webster defines romanticism as a literary, artistic, and philosophical movement originating in the 18th century, characterized chiefly by a reaction against neoclassicism and an emphasis on the imagination and emotions, marked especially in an exaltation of the primitive and common man, an appreciation of external nature, an interest in the remote, a predilection for melancholy, and the use of poetry of older verse forms. And nationalism is described as loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others, and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations and supranational groups. So, how does that relate to the Brothers Grimm? And how did that relate to German Romanticism of the time? So, German Romanticism of the time was a reaction to the Napoleonic Wars and occupation. They viewed the past as more pure civil way of life. So picture like Snow White, that vision of the little birds chirping, and there's no technology, and it's in the Middle Ages, and she's in that little dirndl, is what that dress is called. So that was compared to the war and destruction of the time. It was seen as better, romanticizing the past, the way that things were pre-occupation, and the idea of Germanness being better. And so there was this focus on the idea of a nation state, of this shared past of, we're all German, we can all relate to this idea of Germanness. And so there was a lot of discussion about what that meant culturally, what the values of Germany are, and what the stories, the history of Germany was. And so that, despite all of these small kingdoms and duchies, that's a false idea. And so there was a lot of xenophobia, there was a lot of rejection of anything French, of anything non-German at the time. So during this time, Jacob Grimm attended the Congress of Vienna and the Frankfurt National Assembly. And so what those did is they focused on, what is Germany? How would we look at Germany? How would we unify Germany if we could? Mostly it was a battle between Prussia and Austria, thinking about the two main players, if they would rule over the others, what that would mean for the smaller nation states, if it would be more liberal, more conservative. And so the brothers at this time, they were mentored by Friedrich Karl von Savigny, and they were enthralled by this idea of Germanness, this connection back to the past, and what real Germanness meant. And they found that in the folk, in English, specifically in this sort of idea of peasants and the lower class being the real German people. And so starting out, they wanted to keep the tales as close to the original tales as possible. However, this changed over time. So getting into Kinder- und Hausmärchen, or the Brother Grimm's fairy tales as we know it in English. It is an anthology consisting of real German fairy tales and folk tales. The project included many alterations, edits over the years. There are 7 editions over 45 years, so obviously it changed. The Brothers Grimm, over time, created it to be more of what they wanted the stories to be and what they felt would sell better versus the original tales. There were over 150 tales in the first edition, and the most well-known tales that I focused on are Cinderella, Rapunzel, and Little Red Riding Hood. They also criticized other folk anthologies of the time for being too international. So this is a painting from 1897, I believe, I can't remember the name right now, but those 2 guys up there are the Brothers Grimm, and they are meeting with a woman who the painting calls the Märchenfrau, which means the fairy tale woman. Now, this scene that we know and have come to expect from the Brothers Grimm is actually entirely false. So the tales were not actually from the folk or from the peasant class. They were mostly upper class perspectives from friends of the brothers, and they were collected mainly through letters. So this never happened, basically. And so an interesting idea that comes from Jack Zipes' Breaking the Magic Spell is that folk tales are tales that come from the actual folk, whereas fairy tales are tales that come from those upper class perspectives. When you think about Jack and the Beanstalk, you think about Cinderella, where they're like lottery stories, where a poor person gets all of this opulence, all of these magic items, and that enables them to move up in class. However, this is false, as the upper class would never accept a lower class person like this. So the fairy tale is a sort of propaganda meant to keep the lower class in check, keep them hopeful, while also keeping them down. So the idea is that the Grimms actually have fairy tales instead of folk tales like they hoped, because they drew these stories from upper class perspectives. So, getting into the international origins of the tales that I selected, and starting out with Cinderella. So Cinderella, you can actually find narratives of Cinderella dating back to 9th century China. It comes from all over the world. All of these tales that are up on the slide have the same things that we have come to expect from Cinderella. She's got the slippers, she's got the ball, she's got the new fancy dress, and she's usually got a stepmother or stepsisters who are in her way. And the main one of these that's important is Cinderella from France. That's going to be the one that we all have mostly come to know. That's the one that's closest to the Disney version. And so getting into Rapunzel. Rapunzel comes from Italy, France. All has to do with the girl, the tower, and usually she is named after a kind of lettuce or a kind of herb. She's named parsley, or Rapunzel is actually a kind of lettuce. And Rapunzel, the German tale, is actually from Friedrich Schultz, who I believe is Austrian as well, but he translated it into German. And so going into Little Red Riding Hood, there's the richly laden ship from Belgium, which deals with a little girl in a red hood being taken to a wolf's den. She's not eaten. In France, she is eaten, and that's where the tale ends. That's it. There's no huntsman who comes and saves her. No happy ending in France, unfortunately. And so getting into the brothers' tales. So, Aschenputtel, very similar to Cinderella. The only difference is that instead of the mice, there's the doves that come and help her. And she, instead of having a fairy godmother, shakes a tree that grows on her mother's grave in order to get all of her stuff for the ball. Rapunzel, pretty much just Friedrich Schultz's version, but in this new mythology. And then Wolf Kitchen is the story that we all know and love with Red Riding Hood. There's the new ending, there's the huntsman character, and Red Riding Hood learns her lesson without being beaten. So getting into romanticism in the Grimm's work, how can we see romanticism and these big ideas that I've been talking about through the lens of these fairy tales? So Aschenputtel, Rotkäppchen, and Rapunzel all have very natural settings. They all have isolated characters. You think about Cinderella being forced to stay home from the ball, Red Riding Hood going through the forest, her grandmother not living with anyone, etc., and Rapunzel being in her tower. There's also the melancholy that was talked about earlier. Rapunzel, she wanders in a desolate land, seeking her prince who has been blinded by Mother Gothel. And yeah, it's just going back to that simpler time, the Middle Ages. So, getting into the conclusion, why does all of this matter? Why does it matter that we can see romanticism, that we can see nationalism, all of these ideals through this lens of fairy tales? It matters because attempts to romanticize a shared past or a purist ideal are warning signs for something greater, something that is insidious and that can lead to violence, war, death, etc. Nation building, or what the Grimms did basically in creating all of these tales and selling them to the people as German tales, purely German tales, that's not true history. History is written by the victors, and it's something that we should be aware of in all of the media that we consume, even things like fairy tales. Thank you.
Okay, great. Questions for Keygan? Yes.
So when you say that they got these stories from like friends, so like did they get multiple versions of the stories and then they piece theirs together, or how did that work?
That's a really good question, and that's not necessarily in the scope of my research. But from what I understand, probably because these tales are very ubiquitous, you know, I mean, Cinderella, that translation from France has been around since the 1600s, so I'm sure that multiple sources had read that tale. Yeah. Yes.
You said that usually with this sort of trying to create a creativity of unifying them and leads to something bigger. Is there an example of something that occurred in Germany as a result of like what the Grimm brothers did?
Not necessarily. I know that nationalism was a big thing in a lot of countries leading up to like World War I. I don't have anything specific for that now.
When researching your chosen stories, like what was probably like one of your favorite findings about a specific story?
So, I think that the most interesting one was that the Greek version of Cinderella revolves around cannibalism. It's an entire family, and they hold a spinning contest to see who they're gonna eat. And they end up eating their mother, so yeah, it's interesting, I guess. Yes.
Keygan, could you go back to the slide where you talk about romanticism, how it can be dangerous? I mean, whichever, right there, that one. I just think that's very interesting. You want to go over it again? Sure.
Yeah, so I mean, if we romanticize this sort of idea of a shared past, I mean, think about, in like our history textbooks right now, there's been a move to erase language regarding the horrors of the Civil War and attempts to make American history seem better. So I think that that's sort of how it applies today. Yes. Yeah.
So, to what extent did this sort of nationalistic discourse surrounding these fairy tales happen in other European countries at that time? Was it uniquely prominent within Germany, or was this a similar phenomenon that happened elsewhere?
I don't know. Because my thesis is on German fairy tales. However, that would be a very interesting thesis for you.
Romanticism is multinational.
Yeah, romanticism is multinational. Nationalism, obviously not a thing that just occurs in Germany. Romanticism was a thing that happened across Europe.
Yeah. So obviously German nationalism, had its special moment in a uniquely horrible way. So.
Yes.
My question sort of ties in with his. I mean, you could have told the story from a Greek standpoint, from the French standpoint. Why Germany? I'm really interested in place. So why choose Germany?
I'm a German minor. So, I'm an accounting major. I didn't want to do accounting research. And this path was open to me because I'm a German minor, so I thought that would be interesting.
So you talked about class perspective in this. What was the socioeconomic status of the Grimm's brothers going into this?
Ooh, so I believe that they were pretty well-to-do. One thing that I didn't end up mentioning is I believe it was Jacob Grimm who was the official librarian to the Napoleon-placed monarch of Hesse. So they were fairly well-to-do. They were well-known academics.
Good job, Keygan. Excellent way to end the fall symposium. I am so happy you didn't do accounting research. It has been such a pleasure to have Keygan as an honors student and a German student. I cannot fully express how lucky I feel that you participated in both programs and I got to work with you on this project. You did such an incredible job. I'm very lucky, and I'm really proud to give you this and your cord, and you'll wear, I hope, both at graduation in recognition of the amazing